She said her ex was toxic and gone for good. Then I saw her walking hand in hand with him at a farmer's market. I met her at a coffee shop 3 months ago. One of those perfect autumn mornings where the leaves were just starting to turn and the air had that crisp bite that makes you want to wrap your hands around a warm mug. She was sitting alone at a corner table, reading some paperback novel with a torn cover, and when she looked up and smiled at me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. We started talking that day and didn't stop for hours. She told me about her job, her tiny apartment with the leaky faucet she couldn't afford to fix, her collection of vintage teacups she'd inherited from her grandmother. Everything felt so natural, so easy. When she mentioned her past relationships, she got this distant look in her eyes and said she'd had one serious boyfriend in college who had completely destroyed her trust. The way she talked about him made my heart ache for her. She'd curl up smaller in her chair, her voice would get quieter, and she'd stare at her coffee cup like it held all the answers. He was toxic, she said. A manipulator who had cheated on her with multiple people and made her feel like she was going crazy. She blocked him on everything after they broke up, changed her phone number, even avoided certain parts of town where they used to hang out together. He was dead to her, completely dead. I admired her strength. Here was this amazing woman who had been through hell and came out the other side, building a new life for herself. She had this way of lighting up when she talked about small pleasures, the smell of old books, the perfect cup of coffee, the way sunlight looked through her kitchen window in the morning. It made me want to protect that light in her, to make sure no one ever dimmed it again. We started spending more and more time together. She'd come over to my place, and we'd cook dinner together, nothing fancy, just pasta and whatever vegetables we could find on sale. She'd tell me about her day while chopping onions, how her coworker had brought in homemade cookies, or how she'd found a $20 bill in her jacket pocket from last winter. These tiny moments felt huge to me. I started falling for her hard. The way she'd scrunch up her nose when she was concentrating. How she'd unconsciously hum while doing dishes. The soft sound of her breathing when she'd fall asleep on my couch during movie nights. I'd cover her with a blanket and just sit there watching her, feeling this overwhelming tenderness that scared me with its intensity. She never wanted to make our relationship official on social media. She said she preferred to keep things private, that she'd had bad experiences with putting her personal life online. I respected that. She seemed to value privacy in general. She never talked much about her family beyond mentioning that they lived across the country, and she didn't have many close friends in town since she'd moved here for work only a year ago. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at her phone with this worried expression, but when I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd always brush it off. Work stress, she'd say, or family drama. Nothing major. I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because the alternative was admitting that maybe I didn't know her as well as I thought I did. The lies started small. She'd cancel plans at the last minute, saying she wasn't feeling well or had to work late. Then she'd post photos on her social media of her out and about, looking perfectly fine. When I'd ask about it later, she'd claim the photos were old or that she'd felt better after resting. I told myself I was being paranoid, that everyone had the right to change their mind about plans. But then there were the weekends she'd disappear completely. She'd say she was visiting a friend in the next town over, someone I'd never heard her mention before. She'd be unreachable for hours at a time, and when she'd finally text back, her responses would be short and distracted. I started to feel like I was losing her, like she was slowly slipping away from me without explanation. The worst part was how she'd look at me sometimes, like she was seeing someone else. Like she was comparing me to some ghost I couldn't compete with. I'd try to bring it up gently, asking if everything was okay between us, if there was anything she needed to talk about. She'd always reassure me that things were perfect, that she was just stressed about work or tired from not sleeping well. I wanted to believe her so badly that I ignored the growing pit in my stomach. I ignored the way she'd flinch sometimes when I'd reach for her hand. I ignored how she'd change the subject whenever I brought up future plans, even simple ones like what we might do next weekend. I was so afraid of pushing her away that I pushed down my own concerns instead. Update 1. Sunday morning came with that perfect October weather that makes you want to spend the whole day outside. I've been planning to stay in and catch up on laundry, but the sunshine streaming through my windows was too tempting to ignore. I decided to walk to the farmer's market downtown, maybe pick up some fresh bread and those apples they had last week that tasted like childhood. The market was busier than usual, full of families with kids running between stalls and couples browsing the pumpkin displays. I was standing in line at the bakery stall, debating between sourdough and whole wheat, when I saw her. At first, I thought I was imagining things. She was about 50 feet away, laughing at something, her head thrown back in that genuine way that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. But she wasn't alone. There was a man with her, tall and lean with dark hair, and they were holding hands. My first thought was that maybe she'd made a new friend, that this was innocent. But then I saw the way he was looking at her, the way she was leaning into him, and I knew. This wasn't friendly. This was intimate. This was the kind of comfortable closeness that comes from knowing someone deeply, from sharing inside jokes and morning coffee and quiet moments. I felt like I was watching my life implode in slow motion. The bread I'd been planning to buy suddenly seemed completely unimportant. My legs felt shaky, and I had to grab onto the edge of the stall counter to steady myself. The woman running the bakery asked if I was okay, but I couldn't form words. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked away, gone home, and tried to process what I'd seen. Instead, I found myself following them at a distance, weaving between other market-goers, staying just close enough to keep them in sight. They moved through the market like they belonged together, stopping at different stalls, sharing samples of cheese and fruit. She'd point out things to him, and he'd nod and smile, sometimes putting his arm around her shoulders. They looked happy. They looked like a couple who'd been together for months, not like someone who was cheating or sneaking around. The worst part was watching her face. She was glowing in a way I'd never seen before, completely relaxed and open. With me, she'd always seemed slightly guarded, like she was holding back part of herself. But with him, all those walls were down. She was herself in a way that made me realize she'd never been fully herself with me. They bought vegetables and flowers, chatting with the vendors like they were regulars. A few people even seemed to know them together, waving and calling out greetings. This wasn't new. This had been going on for a while. When they started walking toward the parking area, I knew I should stop following them. But I couldn't. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what was happening to my life. They got into his car, a blue sedan that looked well-maintained but not flashy, and I managed to see which direction they headed. Without really thinking about what I was doing, I went to my own car and followed them, staying several cars back. They drove through downtown, past the coffee shop where we'd first met, past the movie theater where we'd seen 3 films together. They turned into a residential neighborhood, one of those tree-lined areas with small houses and tidy front yards. The kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors and kids rode bikes in the streets. He pulled into the driveway of a small craftsman-style house with a red front door and flower pots on the porch. They got out together, and she had keys. She unlocked the front door like she lived there. I sat in my car at the end of the block, hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to process what I was seeing. She had keys to his house. She was comfortable there. This wasn't a casual meetup or a chance encounter. This was her other life, the one she'd been hiding from me. I watched them through the front window as they moved around inside, putting away their market purchases, looking domestic and comfortable. At one point, she stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, and it was so natural, so easy, that it made my chest tight with pain. That's when I realized I had to know who he was. I had to know if this was the ex she'd told me was dead to her, or if this was someone new, which would somehow be even worse. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with questions and scenarios. How long had this been going on? Was I the other woman in this situation? Had anything she'd told me been true? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything she'd said about her past, looking for clues I'd missed. The way she talked about her ex, the pain in her voice when she described what he'd put her through. Had it all been an act? Or had something changed that she hadn't told me about? I thought about confronting her, but what would I say? How do you ask someone to explain their entire secret life? How do you admit that you followed them like some kind of stalker? By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed more information before I could decide what to do. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Update 2. I spent the next week in a strange state of hyper-awareness, analyzing every interaction we had for clues I might have missed before. When she canceled plans on Tuesday, claiming she had a work emergency, I found myself driving past the house where I'd seen her with him. His car was in the driveway, and through the kitchen window, I could see 2 figures moving around together. The rational part of my brain kept telling me to just ask her directly, to have an honest conversation about what I'd seen. But there was this other part of me that was terrified of what I might learn. As long as I didn't know the full truth, I could still pretend that maybe there was some innocent explanation. Thursday evening, she came over to my place like nothing had happened. She brought takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and settled in on my couch like she belonged there. We watched a movie, and she fell asleep with her head on my shoulder, just like she had so many times before. I sat there looking down at her peaceful face, wondering how someone could compartmentalize their life so completely. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I did something I'm not proud of. I looked through her phone. It was sitting on my nightstand, charging, and the temptation was too strong to resist. I knew her passcode because I'd seen her enter it dozens of times. What I found made my blood run cold. Text messages going back months with someone saved in her contacts as M, just the letter M. The messages were intimate, full of inside jokes and planning for future dates. References to their place and discussions about groceries and bills. But the most devastating part was the timestamps. She'd been texting him constantly, even while she was with me. I scrolled back through weeks of conversations, and slowly, a picture emerged that made me feel sick. They hadn't just been seeing each other casually. They were living together, at least part-time. They were planning a future together. And from the tone of the messages, this had been going on since before I'd even met her. There were references to me in some of the messages, but not by name. She'd referred to that situation or the other thing I have to deal with. In one message, he'd asked if she was still playing that game, and she'd responded that it was more complicated than expected, but that she'd handle it soon. Reading those words felt like being punched in the stomach. I was that situation. I was a game she was playing, a complication she needed to handle. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it and tried to act normal when she came out of the bathroom. She made coffee and toast, humming while she moved around my kitchen, and I wondered how she could be so calm while living such an elaborate lie. That weekend, I made a decision that probably wasn't smart, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to see them together again to understand the dynamic between them. I drove to the house on Saturday afternoon and parked across the street, far enough away that I wouldn't be noticed but close enough to see. What I witnessed over the next 2 hours changed everything I thought I knew about the situation. They weren't just a couple having an affair. They were planning something bigger. I watched as an older couple arrived at the house, carrying what looked like wedding magazines and sample books. The woman looked exactly like her, but 30 years older, clearly her mother. The man with them was probably her father. They stayed for about an hour, and through the front window, I could see all 5 of them gathered around the dining room table, looking at papers and pointing at things. When the older couple left, they hugged both her and the man like they were family, like they approved of whatever was happening between them. As they walked to their car, I heard the older woman call out something about the engagement party and how excited she was. Engagement party. They were engaged. I sat in my car, stunned into silence, as the pieces started falling into place. This wasn't just an affair or a rekindled romance. This was a full relationship, complete with family involvement and future plans. And somehow, I'd been completely oblivious to all of it. The worst part was realizing that everyone in her life probably knew about him. Her parents, probably her friends, maybe even her coworkers. They all knew she was engaged to someone else, which meant they all knew I was being lied to. I thought about all the times she'd mentioned her family, how they lived far away, and she didn't talk to them much. Another lie. They were clearly involved in her life, involved enough to be planning an engagement party with her and her fiancé. That night, I couldn't pretend anymore. When she texted asking if she could come over, I told her we needed to talk. She arrived an hour later with a bottle of wine and that smile that had first drawn me to her, but now it just looked fake. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say, but when she walked into my living room and settled onto my couch like she owned the place, all my planned words disappeared. Instead, I found myself asking her a simple question that I already knew the answer to. I asked her if there was anything she needed to tell me about her life, anything important she might have left out. She looked confused, tilted her head in that way that used to seem endearing but now felt manipulative. She said she didn't know what I meant, that everything was fine between us. So I told her about the farmer's market, about seeing her with him, about following them to the house. The change in her expression was immediate and dramatic. The confusion disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like relief, like she was tired of keeping up the pretense. But then, instead of explaining or apologizing, she did something I didn't expect. She started crying. Not the gentle tears of someone who felt guilty about hurting me, but the desperate sobs of someone whose carefully constructed world was falling apart. She curled up on my couch, her whole body shaking, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then she started talking, and what she said made me realize that I still didn't understand the full scope of what was happening. Update 3. Through her tears, she told me a story that was somehow both completely different from what I'd imagined and infinitely worse. The man I'd seen her with was indeed her college ex, the one she'd claimed was dead to her. But the story about him cheating and being toxic? That had been true, at least partially. They had broken up badly in college. He had cheated, and she had been devastated. She'd moved across the country to get away from him, started over in a new city, and genuinely thought she'd never see him again. But 6 months ago, he tracked her down. At first, she'd refused to see him. She blocked his calls and ignored his messages. But he'd been persistent, showing up at her work, at her apartment, at places she went regularly. He'd claimed he'd changed, that he'd been in therapy, that he understood now how badly he'd hurt her and wanted to make things right. Eventually, she'd agreed to meet him for coffee, just to get closure and make him understand that she'd moved on. But he'd been different. Calmer, more mature, seemingly genuinely remorseful for what he'd done to her. He'd told her about the work he'd been doing on himself, showed her letters he'd written but never sent, convinced her that he was a changed person. What she didn't tell me was that she'd been struggling with loneliness. The move across the country had been harder than she'd expected. She'd had trouble making friends, and dating had been a series of disappointments. When I'd met her, she'd been in therapy trying to work through her trust issues, but she'd stopped going because she couldn't afford it anymore. So when her ex had reappeared, promising to be different, offering her the familiar comfort of someone who knew her history, she'd been more vulnerable than she'd wanted to admit. She'd started seeing him again, just as friends, she claimed. But it had escalated quickly. The problem was timing. She'd already been seeing me for a few weeks when he'd come back into her life. She'd been happy with me, she said, genuinely happy. But she'd also been confused and overwhelmed by his sudden reappearance and the feelings it brought up. Instead of choosing between us or being honest with either of us, she decided to see where things went with both relationships. She told herself it was temporary, that she'd figure out what she wanted and then make a clean break with whoever she didn't choose. But weeks had turned into months, and the situation had gotten more complicated instead of clearer. Her ex had proposed to her 6 weeks ago, and she'd said yes, but she'd also continued seeing me because she couldn't bear to hurt me or let me go. The engagement party her parents had been planning? It was supposed to happen next month. Her parents had flown in to help with preparations, and they had no idea I existed. As far as they knew, she'd been with her ex this entire time, working through their issues and building toward a future together. She'd been living 2 completely separate lives, and the stress of maintaining both had been eating away at her. The canceled plans, the mysterious disappearances, the distant looks, they'd all been symptoms of someone trying to be 2 different people at once. What made it even worse was that she claimed she loved us both, in different ways. Her ex represented her past, her history, the comfort of someone who knew her completely. I represented possibility, newness, the chance to be someone different than who she'd been before. She convinced herself that she was protecting both of us by not choosing immediately. She'd thought she could figure out her feelings without hurting anyone, but instead, she'd created a situation where everyone would inevitably be hurt. The crying had stopped while she was explaining, replaced by a hollow exhaustion that made her look older than her years. She kept saying she'd never meant for things to get so complicated, that she just needed time to figure out what she wanted. But as she talked, I realized something that made my stomach drop even further. This wasn't a woman who was torn between 2 options. This was someone who had already made her choice but was too afraid to face the consequences. Every detail she shared made it clear that her real life was with him. The house they shared, the engagement, the involvement of her parents, those were real. I was the fantasy, the escape, the thing she did when she wanted to pretend she was someone else. When I asked her directly which of us she was going to choose, she looked at me with such sadness that I knew the answer before she said it. She was going to marry him. She'd probably always been going to marry him, from the moment he convinced her to give him another chance. But then she said something that turned my entire understanding of the situation upside down once again. She told me that her parents thought I was the affair, that they knew about me, but they believed I was some kind of rebound or mistake she was working through. Her fiancé knew about me too, and he'd been incredibly understanding about the whole thing, chalking it up to her need to explore her options before settling down. They were all waiting for her to end things with me and focus on her real relationship. The engagement party was supposed to be her public commitment to choosing her real life over her temporary distraction. I was the other woman in my own relationship, and I'd been the only one who didn't know it. Final update. The conversation that followed was probably the most painful hour of my life. She tried to explain how she'd gotten so deep into the deception that she couldn't find a way out. She'd been planning to end things with me after the engagement party, she said, once she'd made her commitment to him official. She wanted to let me down gently, to make it seem like a natural drift apart rather than a sudden abandonment. She'd thought it would hurt less that way, but she'd also been too afraid to face my reaction to the truth. What she didn't seem to understand was that her plan to protect my feelings had actually made everything infinitely worse. The lies, the deception, the elaborate double life, it was all so much more hurtful than honesty would have been. I asked her if anything about our relationship had been real, if any of the moments we'd shared had meant something to her, or if I'd just been a diversion while she worked through her commitment issues. She insisted that her feelings for me had been genuine, that the time we'd spent together had been some of the happiest of her life. But she also admitted that she'd always known, somewhere deep down, that she was going to choose him in the end. I realized that I'd fallen in love with someone who was essentially playing a role. The woman I thought I knew, the one who was rebuilding her life after a toxic relationship, who valued privacy and took things slowly, she didn't really exist. She was a character created to make our relationship possible while she figured out her real life. The worst part was that she seemed to expect me to understand her position, to sympathize with how difficult the situation had been for her. She kept saying how hard it had been to maintain two relationships, how stressful it had been to keep track of all the lies. I wanted to feel angry, and part of me did, but mostly I just felt hollow, empty. Like the past few months of my life had been erased, revealed to be nothing more than an elaborate performance. She asked if we could still be friends someday, after things settled down. She said she'd always care about me and hoped I could forgive her eventually. The request was so tone-deaf, so completely disconnected from the reality of what she'd done, that I almost laughed. I told her to leave, and she did, but not before trying to hug me goodbye. I stepped away from her, and she finally seemed to understand that there was no going back from this, no way to salvage anything from the wreckage she'd created. After she left, I sat in my living room for hours, looking at all the traces of her presence in my space. The mug she'd used that morning, still sitting on my coffee table. The book she'd been reading, bookmarked and left on my nightstand. The spare phone charger she'd brought over and forgotten to take home. I gathered all of it up and put it in a box, then put the box in my closet where I wouldn't have to see it. I wasn't ready to throw it away yet, but I couldn't stand having it out in the open, reminding me of how thoroughly I'd been deceived. The next few weeks were brutal. I kept expecting her to reach out, to try to explain further or apologize more thoroughly. But she didn't. She'd gotten what she'd wanted from the conversation, my knowledge of the truth and an end to the deception. She could move forward with her real life now, free from the complication I'd represented. I found myself driving past the house sometimes, like a habit I couldn't break. Once, I saw her in the front yard, planting flowers with her fiancé. They looked happy, domestic, like a couple preparing for their future together. The engagement party happened 3 weeks after our last conversation. I knew because she'd posted photos on social media, the same social media she'd claimed to avoid because she valued privacy. She looked radiant in the pictures, surrounded by family and friends who were all celebrating her upcoming marriage. I realized that in all the photos from the party, she looked more like herself than she ever had with me. More relaxed, more genuine, more fully present. It was confirmation that I'd been right about being the fantasy while he was the reality. I deleted her number from my phone and unfollowed her on all social media platforms. I couldn't handle seeing updates from her real life, the life I'd never really been part of. But the hardest part wasn't getting over her, exactly. It was learning to trust my own judgment again. How had I missed so many signs? How had I been so completely fooled by someone I thought I was getting to know intimately? I started questioning everything about the relationship, analyzing every conversation and interaction for clues I should have picked up on. The inconsistencies in her stories, the way she deflected certain questions, the mysterious gaps in her schedule, it had all been there, but I'd chosen to trust her instead of my own instincts. 3 months later, I saw the wedding photos. She looked beautiful, genuinely happy, and I had to admit that she'd probably made the right choice for herself. They belonged together in a way that she and I never had. But that didn't make the deception any less painful or the betrayal any less real. I never did get a real apology from her. No acknowledgement of how the lies had affected me. No understanding of why her approach had been so hurtful. I think she genuinely believed she'd been trying to protect everyone involved, that her intentions had been good despite the devastating execution. But intentions don't undo damage, and good reasons don't erase bad actions. I learned that someone can hurt you deeply while still believing they're doing the right thing, and that understanding their motives doesn't make the pain any less real. It took me almost a year to feel ready to date again, and even then, I found myself hypervigilant about inconsistencies and red flags. I'd learned to trust my instincts more and to ask direct questions instead of making assumptions. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. It made me more careful about who I let into my life, but also more intentional about the relationships I do choose to pursue. I learned the difference between privacy and secrecy, between taking things slow and being deliberately evasive. Most importantly, I learned that love isn't enough if it's not built on honesty. All the genuine feelings in the world can't sustain a relationship that's based on deception, no matter how well-intentioned that deception might be. I still think about her sometimes, wonder if she ever thinks about me or feels any regret about how things ended. But I've made peace with the fact that I'll probably never know. Some stories don't get neat endings or satisfying closure. Sometimes you just have to accept that you were a chapter in someone else's book, not the main character in your own love story that you thought you were writing. The woman I fell in love with was real to me, even if she was just a role someone else was playing. The feelings I had were genuine, even if the relationship was built on lies. And that has to be enough, because it's all I have left of those months when I thought I'd found something special. Now I know better. But I also know that being deceived doesn't make me naive, and being hurt doesn't make me weak. It just makes me human, and more careful about where I choose to place my trust next time.